Hi guys, it's Mason from Varsity, and today we're going to be doing a topic analysis video for the May NCFL PFD topic, which is resolved. African countries should prioritize industrial development above international debt repayment. So this is pretty much a sequencing question of what should African countries put first. Should their limited public money go first towards either paying back foreign creditors, which is like foreign countries outside of Africa, or international banks like the IMF and the World Bank? Or should that money instead go to domestic industrial development? So before we dive into really quickly AF versus NEG, I just want to get into what the main clash is going to be. Now, there's really only one clash point, and it's like fiscal priority. But there are some details that are going to come up in almost every debate. The first being the idea of what helps the future of African economies. I think this is going to be very important because on either side, you can sort of argue that pursuing our idea is going to lead to a future in which we have a strong enough economy to be able to successfully do both, to be able to both invest in industry and pay back foreign creditors. So I think an important impact that you're going to need to win is long-term, future economic size, because then you can pretty much straight up tell the judge, hey, we're telling you we prioritize X, but that doesn't mean you don't get Y. In our world, you get Y, but in a decade. But ultimately, the long-term stability of these African economies is going to be better off if you temporarily put Y on the back burner. And I think AF can get at this because they can say, right now, Africa as a whole, a lot of these countries are in just major debt traps. All of these creditors don't have African countries' best interests at heart. They're largely looking to exploit them for both the money being paid back to them with interest, as well as access to African resources like raw materials, in terms of in the case of China with their Belt and Road Initiative, access to African industry itself, ports, factories, all that kind of jazz. So on AF, you can say, we need to stop playing right into the hands of imperial powers that are attempting to gut Africa and take all of its natural resources for themselves. And instead, we need to give them the finger for a bit, as they've been giving us for decades, and focus on our own domestic industry. Because we wouldn't need these foreign creditors, and that's what you say on AF, we wouldn't need these foreign creditors if we had sufficient industry in our own country. Meaning that not only can you sort of bat back a lot of neg impacts, saying you lose access and you lose leverage over foreign creditors by saying that, we don't really need you guys anymore if we have strong financial systems in our own country, if we have strong industry in our own country, if we have strong revenue streams in our own country, but also in having those strong revenue streams, we can then pay back those loans in the future along with whatever, minimal economic troubles that they gave us for not paying them back immediately. So I think that's how you approach that clash on AF. And on neg, it's very, very intuitive. African countries took out these loans. They must pay back their creditors, or else, one, it increases the costs of securing such loans in the future. Two, it may potentially cut you off from those creditors entirely. And three, it may increase the cost of doing trade via sanctions or other sorts of penalties applied upon your country if you don't pay back international banks or major countries and trade hubs that you seek to do business with in the future. So the argument on neg is that, yeah, industry is important, but industry requires investment. Rome wasn't built in a day, neither is African industrial development going to be built in a day. So you have to have the investment and the capital to build up your industry in the first place. And where does Africa get a lot of its capital? Where does it get necessary funding? From foreign creditors. So if you piss off those creditors, if you cut off your access to international funding, you significantly degrade your own ability to build up industry into the future, meaning that you hamstring yourself and plateau yourself by cutting yourself off from major investment opportunities. So I think that's how both sides play into the major clash of future-proofing African economies and securing both priorities in the long run. Now let's go in and look at some specific arguments that you can run on AF versus some specific arguments that I really like that you can run on neg. Again, shameless plug here. You can find all of the evidence that I use to build up my own knowledge of the topic, to research the topic. We have like over 550 pages of evidence, crap ton of cards, all at varsitybriefs.com. So if you're curious about anything I'm talking about in this video, head over there, buy our brief for NCFL, and I don't know, it'll definitely help you win the tournament. All right, now let's talk AF. This is what I think is going to be the stronger side, especially in front of judges who sort of like know what they're talking about, have a grasp of the African region, and understand the exploitation that African economies have gone through under Western creditors and even creditors like China. So I think you're coming into this debate with the academic side. So there's going to be a lot of good statistical evidence. There's going to be a lot of good examples as to why African economies need to get themselves into a state of independence and lower reliance on foreign creditors. Now, in the brief, I have a lot of very good specific arguments why this is the case. First, it can accelerate their tech progress, which is sort of the argument that once you industrialize, you can start developing a lot of technological manufacturing and skilled labor inside of your countries, which is not only very good for economics, but two, very good for independence from major Western countries where a lot of tech originates right now. But three, it's also good to bring in skilled labor into your countries. You know, it helps prevent brain drain. And four, it helps stop the sole reliance on raw material exports, which is a lot of the time where African countries seem to fall, like making a lot of their money by exporting raw materials and minerals, which they often get the short end of the stick from in terms of trade agreements. And that's another argument you can run on AF, specifically on the case of raw minerals. I think a very important thing to note is that like a lot of the time, the processing of those raw minerals, which is where a lot of the money is made because the products are worth so much more processed rather than raw, happens through like factories owned by other countries, owned and operated by other countries. However, if you invest in industry, you can build up processing factories in African countries themselves, owned by the governments, owned by the people, where all of the revenue stays domestic, meaning that you can make a lot more profit off of the raw material exports of your countries, or I guess the processed material after they've been processed by these new factories, before you even have to think about industrializing into other spaces like tech or agro or anything else. Already, with raw minerals, there is a lot of higher margins to be made if you invest in processing factories that are owned and operated domestically. I think that's a good macro level understanding for AF. There's a lot of great, more specific arguments in the brief that I won't waste your time with here because not everybody's going to run them, and because I don't want to give away the secret sauce without people heading over to varsitybriefs.com, so do that. But one last piece of advice for AF. I think a very strong way to end cases would be painting a picture. And I know this is going to sound very lay, but the judges at NCFL are quite lay, specifically in PFD. So I think it's a good idea. Run with it if you want to. Just painting a picture of a future in which African economies are significantly more independent. They have much more domestic revenue, whereas they don't have to rely on foreign creditors. They have stronger industry. They have more control over their own raw minerals. They have more control over high-skilled industry and less reliance on Western and Eastern imperial powers. And in that world, not only do they have a strong domestic industry, but they have so much of a strong domestic industry that they can comfortably have that industry and pay back the creditors. They may have to delay those payments for a few years. They may have to come up with a little bit more money to pay them back happily and secure, regain their international trust and credit. But not only will they be less reliant on those institutions in the first place, but they will have enough cash to be able to comfortably handle those increased costs. I think a very great analogy on both sides, honestly, but specifically for AF, is saying, Judge, on our side, you can have your cake and eat it too. Because I think the best cases are going to be those that prove how you can prioritize both in the long run if you pick one and run with it now. So let's look at neg and see the contrasting view of why neg thinks you should pick and run with continuing to pay creditors. Unfortunately, on neg, I think you're going to have to bite the bullet a little bit in order to have a chance of like sounding reasonable and true, and sort of like admit that, yeah, a lot of international creditors do seek to take advantage of African countries. But I think you have to paint that as sort of a necessary evil, at least in the current squo in which African countries have taken so many of these loans and are currently invested in paying them back. You have to say, yeah, these loans suck. Yeah, they may be taking advantage of African countries, but the loans exist. The governments took them, and now they have a responsibility to pay them back. And that's not just some, high and mighty, moral responsibility. It's an economic responsibility because you cut yourself off from the rest of the world by refusing or, deprioritizing paying back loans that you owe to massive institutions like the World Bank and the IMF that are tied to so many major players in the global economy, like the US. On the other side of the spectrum, China. China offers a lot of loans to African countries and is not happy in the slightest when those loans begin to see weakened payments. So on neg, I think you can spin the angle of African independence into one of attempted isolationism. And there's a few warrants for that. You can say, first, that, if you start to deprioritize paying back loans that you owe to massive, powerful institutions, you're going to have a much harder, or at the very least, a much more expensive time accessing trade, accessing future lines of credit, because you are a more risky investment if you've already proven to default or to delay your repayment of loans that you've taken in the past. So you're going to be attempting to industrialize on your own. And that is not going to be nearly as effective as industrializing with solid investors at the international level. And you can paint it this way. You think of a startup. Think of Africa as a collection of startups. A startup is going to be significantly more successful if they have strong investors to be able to afford all of the down payments on the machines they need, on the factories they may need to build, on all of the servers they may need to build, depending on what the startup is, because they can't always cover that out of pocket. So they're going to have a larger scaled business, they're going to have a more successful business, and they're certainly going to have a business that scales up in a quicker period of time versus one where you don't have any outside investors. And yes, those investors are always looking out for themselves, they're always looking out for the royal we. But that doesn't mean that it can't be a mutually beneficial agreement. The investor makes their own money back because they gave money to somebody in need and they took a risk by investing in your startup. But then the startup founder also comes out on top because of the successful company that they built that would not be possible without the outside investment. And I think you can make a really good case that this is a good analogy for the African continent. In order to successfully industrialize, you need investment. You need to be able to build factories. You need to be able to build up manufacturing. You need to be able to build up infrastructure, to invest in workers. And all of that requires capital. And yes, you may have some capital by deprioritizing paying back loans and instead diverting that repayment money towards industrialization. But you would have significantly more money if you just were able to continuously have lines of credit from the bottomless wallets of the IMF and the World Bank backed by the United States, or from China, depending on whether you're Western or Eastern aligned. You're going to have significantly deeper pockets to industrialize if you don't cut off your major investors. So I think on neg, similar to how I wanted you to end on AF, I think on neg you can end your case by again painting that picture of a world in which Africa ends up with a very industrialized economy, a significantly larger economy than it has today, because it prioritized paying back its creditors first, because it prioritized keeping its investors happy, therefore securing it future lines of credit, greater lines of credit, cheaper lines of credit, easier international trade, to be able to industrialize maybe at a slower initial pace, but overall that curve is going to be more exponential if you have greater access to capital to invest in your infrastructure, because you may be able to today divert, X dollars away from repayment and towards industry, but eventually that money dries up because the industry is going to take years before it gives you any sort of reasonable return, because Rome wasn't built in a day, nor is Africa going to be, meaning that you need some capital deep into the future, at least until you have sufficient industry to be able to sustain yourself. And that doesn't happen overnight. And if you alienate your creditors, you're going to have dried up zero money. You're going to have factories that are half built. You're going to have a manufacturing sector that is 25% done, but not meaningfully done enough to provide you with any sort of returns. And you're going to have significantly harder access to additional foreign money to continue industrializing. Now, before I let you guys go, I do specifically for neg have one really good argument that I am quite proud of, and I think you should definitely take a look at in the brief. I mean, I have 12 really good arguments, but this one stands out to me as something that I would really like people to run, which is that it crowds out business loans. This is going to be really good because not only does it take a very strong neg stance and tie into the strong neg links of like cutting off access to foreign banks, but also it makes it so much more relevant to the AF case and is a very good turn. So the argument here is that firms, like businesses, need to take out loans, right? And so do governments. The US government needs to take out loans. That's what like a bond is. It's pretty much taking out a loan from you if you purchase bonds. So like everybody takes out loans. If you stop paying back your international loans to foreign creditors, they're no longer going to want to be the ones to spot you when you need money. Like if you have an emergency, if you need, or if you just, like need money to, I don't know, build a state-sponsored factory or something, you're going to need to take out a loan. But if you don't have access to foreign banks, you're going to have to look to domestic banks to take out those loans. And it's really bad when the government has to look towards its own domestic banks to take out loans, specifically when it can't get access to foreign creditors, because guess who else goes to those same banks to take out loans? Firms, businesses, the very entities that you want to have access to money on AF in order to industrialize. So it's kind of like, that is crowding out, as the argument suggests, these banks' capacity to, give out loaned money, because they have to pick, I don't know, do I approve this loan to the government, or do I approve it for the business that is necessary to see the country industrialize? And obviously, the banks are more often than not going to provide a loan to the government because they are seen as, more stable, more capable of paying those loans back, which means that domestic businesses have effectively no way to get any sort of money to build themselves up, meaning you can't industrialize in the first place. So I don't know. I think that's a very good argument. I think that's a good mechanism for explaining specifically why decreased access to foreign credit prevents industrialization. Because on the macro level, yeah, it like seems obvious. Less money flowing into the country equals less capital to industrialize with. But if you get pressured, like in cross-X or something, why, it's harder to draw those concrete links unless you have a really good explanation as to, the chain of dollars, as to how foreign credit filters down to a capacity to industrialize. And I think the domestic banks angle is a really good way to get there. So I would highly advise going and looking at that argument. I think it's very strong. All right, I think that wraps up the top-down analysis of the NCFL May topic. I would highly advise going to varsitybriefs.com and looking at the resources we have there for your disposal. Also, since it is now May, the NSDA topics for both PFD and LD have dropped. So if you know any LDers, let them know that for NSDA Nationals, we will be producing a Lincoln Douglas debate brief as well as a public forum debate brief. So keep an eye on your email, talk to your coaches, talk to your teammates about the resources that we're going to have coming out. I want you guys to go and put up the best postseason run that is possible. So please go find that evidence. I think it's going to be really helpful. I think you guys are going to do great. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, give us a subscribe, and go debate.